Everyone, and welcome back to the workshop. Today I'm working with a really unique and rare piece of wood. This is Rus or sumac. It's not a wood you come across very often. And what makes it truly special is this deep golden yellow color that runs all the way through the hardwood. Even before turning, you can already see those incredible growth rings and that natural contrast between the hardwood and the lighter sapwood. The texture of this wood is smooth, almost waxy, and it has a light, pleasant smell when you start cutting into it. I've been saving this piece for quite some time, waiting for the right project, and today I'll finally turn it into a natural edge bowl. Let's begin by mounting it between centers on the lathe so we can start shaping the outside. I'll take it slow and steady to find the best balance and reveal the beautiful natural lines hidden inside. Stay with me until the end. The color transformation and final result are really something you don't see every day. With the piece now turning smoothly on the lathe, it's time to start revealing what's hidden inside. I'm using my 16mm crown bowl gouge, a tool I trust for control and precision, especially on a wood like this. The first cuts are always exciting. You never really know what pattern or color will appear. And here, the magic starts immediately. The wood opens up with rich yellow tones and warm brown lines swirling together. Each pass of the gouge brings out more life, more texture, and more of the story that's been growing in this log for years. The shavings are bright, yellow soft, almost like golden ribbons flying through the air. It's such a satisfying moment, the sound of the gouge cutting cleanly, the scent of fresh wood, and the slow transformation from a rough log into something elegant. I'm carefully shaping the curve of the bowl, following the natural form of the wood. The goal isn't perfection, it's balance. I want the lines to flow naturally, as if the bowl had always been waiting inside this piece of wood, just waiting to be discovered. This is one of those moments where time seems to stop, just me, the lathe, and this rare piece of Rus wood, revealing its character one cut at a time. After getting the basic shape of the bowl with a 12mm spindle gouge, it's starting to take form. You can really see the smooth curve beginning to appear, but before going any further, I need to make sure this piece stays solid. The center of the blank has a few small cracks, so I'm applying some thin cyanoacrylate glue to reinforce the fibers and stabilize the core. It only takes a few moments to set, and once it's hardened, I can safely continue turning. Now, with the surface stabilized, I go back to refining the outer shape first, using a round nose scraper to smooth out the tool marks and bring everything together. This step is all about patience, light cuts, gentle pressure, and letting the tool do the work. The form is now flowing nicely, and it's time to create the tenon for the chuck. I carefully shape it to the right size, making sure it fits perfectly for when I reverse the bowl. At this point, you can really see how beautiful the shavings are coming off this wood. Each cut produces these fine curly ribbons, light, soft and golden, almost like strands of sunshine spinning off the tool. That's what makes turning Rus wood such a joy. It's smooth, clean, and surprisingly cooperative, even with its dense and fibrous texture. The colors are just mesmerizing, warm yellows blending into deeper orange tones, with darker streaks running through the grain. It's one of those woods where every pass of the gouge reveals something new, You never quite know what pattern you'll uncover next, and that's what keeps the process so exciting. Now that the outer shape looks the way I want it, I move on to sanding. I start with 120 grit, then slowly work my way through 180, 240, 320, and finally up to 400 grit. It takes time, but this step is essential. It's what gives the surface that silky, almost glass-like feel when you touch it. As the sanding progresses, the surface starts to glow, the grain becomes more pronounced, the contrast deepens, and the natural edge really begins to stand out. It's one of those quiet, almost meditative parts of wood turning, just the sound of the lathe, a bit of dust in the air, and the wood slowly coming to life under your hands. With the outside completely sanded and smooth to the touch, the piece is ready to be reversed. Next, I'll mount it in the chuck and start hollowing out the inside, and that's where the real magic begins. Now that the bowl is reversed and held firmly in the chuck, it's time to open it up and see what's hidden inside. This is the part I always look forward to, where the real character of the wood starts to reveal itself. I begin hollowing the interior using my 16mm crumble gouge, taking light, steady cuts from the center outwards. The moment the tool touches the surface, the bright yellow shavings start to flow again, soft, warm, and full of color. Working inside the bowl feels completely different here. It's not just about shaping, it's about balance, flow, and patience. Every movement of the gouge needs to follow the natural curve of the outside, creating a perfect harmony between both sides. The deeper I go, the more alive the wood becomes. The grain shifts direction, the tones change from pale gold to deeper amber, and faint lines ripple through the hardwood like brushstrokes in a painting. The sound of the tool, the smell of the fresh shavings, the vibration through the handle, it all comes together into this quiet rhythm that makes wood turning so special. There's no rush here, just steady progress, and focus one careful cut at a time, until the inside shape flows exactly the way I imagined it. For this bowl, I want the walls to be as thin and elegant as possible, light but still strong. That means these final cuts need to be precise, controlled, and smooth. To get the best possible finish, I've just resharpened my 16mm bowl gouge. The bevel angle is set to around 40 degrees, and I've also ground down the heel of the gouge slightly. That small detail makes a big difference. It allows me to follow the curve of the bowl more easily and maintain full control right to the bottom. At this stage, even the smallest vibration or wrong movement can leave a mark or change the thickness, so I take my time listening carefully to the sound of each cut and feeling how the tool glides through the fibers. The shavings are incredibly thin now, almost transparent, floating through the air like golden ribbons. It's a delicate process, one that requires patience, focus, and a light touch. But when it's done right, the result is a bowl that feels weightless, perfectly balanced, and alive with color and texture. This is the part I enjoy most, that quiet precision, where every movement matters and the final form slowly reveals itself from within. As I'm finishing the last few cuts inside the bowl, I like to slow down a little and just enjoy this moment. This is where everything comes together, the shape, the balance, the thin walls, every detail has to feel right. The wood almost speaks to you if you listen closely. It tells you how deep to cut, when to ease the pressure, when to stop. That's what I love most about wood turning. It's not just a craft, it's a quiet conversation between you and the material. I really enjoy sharing these moments with you, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you prefer bowls with thin, elegant walls like this one, or ones that feel heavier and more solid in the hand? Let me know down in the comments. I'm always curious what you think. Every piece of wood has its own character and its own story, and turning rosewood is something truly special. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching and spending some time here with me in the workshop. The inside is now almost done, the walls are thin, the curve feels perfect and the surface is smooth. After making the final light cuts on the bottom of the bowl with the scraper, I noticed that this darker section of the wood feels a little softer than the rest. That's something quite common with rosewood. The contrast between the hard and soft areas can be really strong. To make sure the bottom stays firm and stable over time, I'm applying a bit of thin cyanoacrylate glue, also known as CA glue. It soaks deep into the fibers and strengthens the wood from within, giving it a solid feel without changing the look. Once the glue is applied, I spray a small amount of activator to cure it instantly. It hardens right away and leaves the surface perfectly sealed for the next steps. These little details might not be visible in the final piece, but they make a big difference in the long run, especially when you want your work to last for many years. It's a small extra step, but one that separates a simple turned bowl from a truly finished piece of craftsmanship. Now it's time to sand the inside of the bowl. I start with a lower grit and slowly move up to 400, taking my time to make the surface perfectly smooth. With every pass, the grain becomes clearer and the contrast between the golden and darker tones stands out even more. The wood feels silky to the touch, now clean, even, and ready for the best part. Next, I'll apply the finish, and that's when this rosewood will truly come to life. As soon as the oil touches the wood, the transformation begins. The yellow and brown tones in this rosewood come alive, the grain glows, and the whole surface takes on a warm golden radiance. It's like the wood finally shows its true character after patiently waiting through every step of the process. I apply the finish slowly and evenly, making sure every curve and edge is treated with care. This part is one of my favorites, quiet, focused, and deeply satisfying. The scent of the oil, the soft reflection of light on the surface, the way the texture changes under your fingers, it's the perfect ending to hours of careful work. What I love most about this finish is that it stays true to the material. The surface feels natural, not too glossy, not too matte, just honest and warm, exactly the way wood should look and feel. Every time I use this blend, I'm reminded why I love working with natural finishes. They respect the wood, they don't try to cover it up, but rather let it speak for itself. And with this bowl, made from such a rare and beautiful piece of rosewood, that natural character truly shines through. It's always rewarding to see how something so simple, a piece of wood, a bit of patience, and a few drops of oil and wax can turn into something so alive. I hope you've enjoyed watching this process as much as I've enjoyed creating it. Now I'm finishing the bottom part of the bowl. To make it just a little more special, I like to add a small detail here, something subtle, but enough to make the piece truly unique from every angle. Even the base deserves attention, because when someone picks up the bowl, that's often the first thing they notice: how it feels in the hand, how balanced it is, and how much care went into every part of it. With the final cuts complete, The shape feels perfect, smooth, light, and flowing naturally from top to bottom. With the final shaping done, I sand the bottom carefully to make it perfectly smooth and consistent with the rest of the surface. Once it's ready, I apply our own Pipejawood finish, a blend of pure tung oil and natural carnauba wax. This finish brings out the wood's true color while keeping its natural look and texture. It gives protection without darkening or adding too much gloss. The moment the finish touches the surface, the wood starts to glow. The golden and amber tones of the rosewood become deeper and warmer, and the grain looks almost three-dimensional. It's a small area, but it's an important one because it completes the whole piece and ties everything together. Now that the base is done, I move to the final step, applying a bit of mineral oil to the bark. It protects the natural edge and slightly enriches its tone, keeping that raw organic look that makes this bowl so unique. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this moment with me. I really appreciate everyone who follows, comments, and supports our work. If you'd like to own a piece like this, you can visit our website at pipejawood.com, where every item is made with the same care and passion you've just seen. Until next time, take care, stay creative, and keep turning. this project, I decided to use a beautiful piece of olive wood. Olive wood is one of my favorite materials to work with. It has an amazing grain pattern, warm color tones, and a really pleasant natural scent. This piece has been drying for several years, so it's stable and ready for turning. Here I'm trimming the olive wood so that it will fit nicely into the bucket I'll be using as a mold. Later, I'll pour the epoxy resin around it to create the final shape of the blank. It's important to get a good fit now so the resin fills all the gaps evenly and the result looks clean once it's turned on the lathe. For this project, I'll be using Artline Crystal Epoxy resin, which mixes in a 2:1 ratio. I've decided to go with two colors, purple and green, both with a beautiful pearl effect. These colors should create a nice contrast with the olive wood and give the bowl a really unique and vibrant look. Now it's time to mix the epoxy resin. I'm using Artline Crystal Epoxy, which is mixed in a 2:1 ratio, 2 parts resin and 1 part hardener. First, I mix the clear resin slowly but thoroughly to avoid introducing too many bubbles. Then I divide it into 2 separate cups and add the colors purple and green, both with a beautiful pearl effect. Mixing them separately allows the colors to blend naturally once poured, creating soft transitions and a deep shimmering look in the final piece. The Artline Crystal Epoxy is one of the clearest resins I've used so far. It cures without any yellowing, and thanks to its strong UV resistance, it keeps the colors vibrant over time. The viscosity is just right, not too thick, so it flows smoothly around the wood, but thick enough to hold the pigments in place and create nice, dynamic color movement. Another thing I really like is that it has a longer working time, which gives me enough freedom to pour and manipulate the resin exactly how I want before it starts curing. It's perfect for larger projects, river tables or artistic castings like this bowl blank. If you'd like to try this resin yourself, check the video description. There's a discount code waiting for you that works for all Artline epoxy products. I've been really happy with how this resin behaves, clear, easy to mix and reliable every single time. After pouring the resin, I place the mold into the pressure box and pressurize it to about 5.5 bars. This step helps the epoxy fill all the tiny cracks and gaps inside the wood. The best part about using a pressure box is that it completely eliminates air bubbles, so the final bowl blank comes out perfectly clear and solid. After 3 full days, the resin is completely cured, so it's time to open the pressure box and see how everything turned out. I always look forward to this part. It's a bit like unwrapping a present. You never know exactly how the colors have blended until you take the blank out of the mold. As soon as I remove it, I can already see that the surface looks amazing. The epoxy filled every small crack in the olive wood and there are no visible air bubbles at all. That's exactly why using a pressure box makes such a big difference. For this bowl, I used about 4 kilograms of epoxy resin, which gives you a good idea of how much material a project of this size requires. When you combine it with a dense wood like olive, the blank becomes quite heavy, but that also helps with stability during turning. Next, I drill a 55mm hole into the center of the bottom. This will allow me to mount the blank securely on the chuck later on. With the hole drilled and the blank prepared, it's finally ready to go on the lathe, where the real transformation begins, turning it from a raw block into a finished, elegant bowl. Now it's time to mount the bowl blank on the lathe. I secure it firmly onto the chuck and also bring the tailstock up against the center of the blank. This way, I'm sure the base is completely stable and won't move during the first cuts. Once everything is set, I can start turning. At the beginning, I keep the speed around 800 revolutions per minute, just to make sure everything runs smoothly and safely. For rough shaping and truing up the blank into a perfect cylinder, I'm using a round carbide cutter from Record Power. This tool works great for epoxy resin. It cuts cleanly without chipping, and it also handles the transition between the wood and resin really well. With a few careful passes, the surface quickly becomes smooth, and I can start to see the beautiful mix of the olive wood grain and the colored resin coming through. With the blank nicely rounded, I can start shaping the bottom of the bowl. This is one of my favorite parts of the process, when the raw block slowly starts to turn into a real bow shape. I begin by defining the base and the curve of the lower section, making sure the transition between the olive wood and the resin stays smooth and balanced. The resin cuts beautifully here, and the wood gives that natural contrast that really makes the shape stand out. I take my time with light, controlled passes, gradually refining the curve until I get a clean and flowing form. It's important to work carefully at this stage, because the bottom determines the overall proportions and balance of the entire bowl. Now that the bottom is finished, I can move on to shaping the upper part of the bowl. The first thing I need to do is flatten the top surface, because after casting and curing, it's still quite uneven and slightly rough. I take light passes across the top until it's perfectly level, which will make it much easier to define the final shape later on. Once the surface is even, I start working on the upper contour. At this stage, I always like to step back a bit and think about the design, how I want the curve to flow, and what kind of character the bowl should have. Every piece of wood is different, and I try to let the grain and resin patterns guide me toward the right shape. This time, I decided to make the bowl a little different, to give it a personal touch that stands out from my other pieces. I'm adding a small bead detail right where the curve of the bowl begins. It's a subtle design element, but it adds a lot of visual interest and gives the piece a bit of sophistication. Creating small details like this requires a steady hand and patience, but I really enjoy this part. It's where the bowl starts to show its personality. The bead catches the light beautifully and enhances the contrast between the rich tones of olive wood and the shimmering epoxy resin. Even though it's just a small line, it completely changes the overall feel of the piece and makes it truly unique. Here you can really see how much mess epoxy resin can create while turning. This is honestly the only thing that bothers me about working with epoxy. It makes an incredible amount of fine shavings that stick absolutely everywhere. Because of static electricity, these chips cling to the tools, the lathe, my clothes, and even the camera. But that's just part of the process, and once you get used to it, it's not that bad. A good cleanup after each step keeps everything under control. Now that the rough shaping is done, I can focus on the bottom section of the bowl. Here, I'm creating the recess where the chuck jaws will later grip the piece. It's important to get the diameter and depth precise, so the bowl will sit perfectly centered when I turn it around. I also shape a small 55mm circular area in the middle. This will be the perfect spot for attaching our Pipejawood logo at the very end. It's a small finishing touch, but I really like adding our logo to each piece. It's like signing your name on your artwork. Next, I add a small decorative touch to the bottom of the bowl using a skew chisel. This area will later be gripped by the chuck, but I still like to give it a clean, finished look even before reversing the piece. After that, I move on to refining the entire outer surface. I use a combination of different tools to get the shape just right, mainly a tapered scraper and a spindle gouge. The scraper helps remove any small ridges and transitions between the wood and resin, while the spindle gouge allows me to make smooth, flowing cuts along the curve. At this stage, I'm not taking off much material anymore, I'm just refining the shape and preparing the surface for sanding. The goal is to get a perfectly smooth finish straight from the tools, so that later I'll need only minimal sanding to achieve that glass-like surface. Now it's time to start sanding the outside of the bowl, one of the most important steps if you want a perfect finish. I begin with 120 grit, working my way up slowly and carefully. At this stage, I sand dry and focus on removing every single tool mark. The key here is patience. If you rush through the lower grits, the scratches will always show later. After 120, I move through the grits one by one until I reach 600. Each step makes the surface smoother, and you can already see the olive wood and the resin starting to shine a little. Once I reach 600, I switch to wet sanding. This is where the magic really starts to happen. With water, the sanding becomes smoother and cooler, and it prevents dust and overheating. From here, I continue all the way up to 3500 grit, which gives the resin that crystal clear mirror-like surface. You can actually watch the bowl change right in front of your eyes from a matte surface to a deep, glossy reflection. Working with olive wood is always a special experience. It's a hard, dense wood with such beautiful grain patterns, and when you combine it with resin, every layer reveals something new. You never really know what you get until this moment, when the surface is finally smooth and polished. I know sanding doesn't look like the most exciting part of wood turning, but for me it's one of the most rewarding. It's where you see all your previous work pay off, all the shaping, all the time spent, getting the curve just right, everything comes together right here. I'd love to know what you think. Do you enjoy sanding, or is it the part you'd rather skip if you could? Write it down in the comments below. I read them all. And if you've ever worked with epoxy resin yourself, let me know which grit you usually go up to and how glossy you like your finish. I still have a few more steps to go before this surface is ready, but it's already starting to look amazing, and I promise the end result will definitely be worth the wait. Now that the sanding is finished, it's time to start polishing the outside of the bowl. For this, I'm using two different polishing compounds, both completely food safe and handmade. The first one is a coarser compound which contains pumice powder, mineral oil, and beeswax. It removes any remaining micro scratches and gives the surface a soft, even sheen. After that, I move on to the fine compound made with diatomaceous earth, beeswax, and mineral oil. This one really brings out the final gloss and depth. Especially on the epoxy resin, it leaves a beautiful, natural-looking shine that feels smooth to the touch. Both of these polishes are completely food safe, and we are currently still testing them to find the perfect balance between shine and protection. I'm actually curious, would you be interested if we offered these two polishing compounds as a small set in our Pipejawood store? Let me know in the comments below. It's something we've been thinking about, and your feedback would really help us decide For me, this is the most satisfying moment when the bowl starts to glow and all that hard work finally pays off. Now that the bowl is turned around and secured in the chuck, I'm preparing the top surface for the next step. I'm not hollowing the inside yet. Instead, I'm getting the surface perfectly flat so I can use the woodcut tool to cut out another smaller bowl from this blank. It would be a real shame to waste such a beautiful combination of olive wood and epoxy resin, so this tool allows me to make the most out of it. The woodcut bowl saver system lets you cut up to 3 different bowls from a single blank depending on the size and shape. In this case, I'll only cut out one more bowl because this material includes epoxy resin and the tool is primarily designed for solid wood. If you're too aggressive with the cut, the resin can easily chip or tear. So I'll take it slowly and carefully, just enough to get a second beautiful bowl out of the same piece without damaging the material. At this point, I'm finishing the cut with the woodcut tool, carefully separating the smaller bowl from the main blank. I'm taking it slow because this part needs precision. Cutting through both epoxy and olive wood can be tricky, and the goal is to get a clean curve without any tear out. As I get closer to the end, I can feel the resistance change, and that's when I know the cut is almost complete. A few gentle passes later, and the smaller bowl finally comes free. It's always a great feeling when this goes smoothly. From one single blank, I now have 2 beautiful pieces, the main bowl and the smaller one, both with that same stunning mix of olive wood and shimmering epoxy resin. I'm thinking about finishing this smaller bowl in one of the next videos. What do you think? Would you like to see how I turn, sand and finish this little one as well? Let me know in the comments below. If enough of you are interested, I'll definitely make a full video showing every step of that process. Now it's finally time to start hollowing out the inside of the bowl. For this, I'm using my 16mm ball gouge. This one is made by Crown Tools and it's crafted from M42 high-speed steel, which contains cobalt that makes the steel harder and helps it hold the sharp edge for longer compared to standard HSS tools. Even so, when you're working with epoxy resin, the edge dulls much faster than when cutting pure wood. Epoxy is extremely hard and abrasive, so keeping the tool sharp is essential if you want clean cuts and avoid chipping along the transition between the resin and the olive wood. I usually stop and touch up the edge several times during a project like this. It only takes a few seconds, but it makes a big difference in how smooth the surface turns out. When hollowing, I start from the center and gradually move outward, always keeping the bevel supported and taking light passes. The goal is to keep the inside curve consistent with the outer shape, so the wall thickness stays even all around. The epoxy and wood combination creates a really interesting challenge. The tool moves through 2 completely different materials, each with its own resistance. The olive wood cuts beautifully and smoothly, while the epoxy feels more glassy and requires a steadier hand. I love this part of the process because you can actually feel the difference through the tool. Each pass brings the bowl closer to its final form, and the colors and grain patterns start to appear from the inside, just as stunning as they were on the outside. At this point, I'm refining the bottom of the bowl and thinning it down to the desired thickness. It's important that the wall thickness is even all the way through, not only for balance, but also for the overall look and feel of the finished piece. I use several different tools to achieve that. I start with a 30mm round scraper, which helps me smooth out any tool marks and blend the curve nicely from the center toward the sides. The scraper gives me good control near the bottom and helps shape those subtle transitions. After that, I switch to a round carbide cutter, which is perfect for refining the surface and removing the last small imperfections. It leaves a clean finish on both the olive wood and the epoxy resin, so there's less sanding needed later on. Once I'm happy with the shape, I check the wall thickness using a special measuring tool designed for bowls. This way, I can be sure that the thickness is consistent all the way around, neither too thin nor too heavy. Getting this part right makes a big difference. When the thickness is even, the bowl feels perfectly balanced in the hands and has that light, elegant feel that separates a good piece from a great one. What you see me marking here with the pen are small areas in the epoxy that still have minor imperfections. I like to mark them before sanding, so I can clearly see where a little more work is needed. This way I can fix those spots more precisely and make sure the surface is perfectly smooth before moving on to sanding. Now that the shape of the bowl is finished, it's time to start sanding the inside. Just like on the outside, I begin with 120 grit and work my way through all the grits slowly and patiently all the way up to 3500. At this stage, the key is consistency. I make sure to keep moving the sandpaper evenly, following the curve of the bowl, so the surface stays smooth without creating any flat spots. I sand dry up to 600 grit and then switch to wet sanding, which really brings out the depth in the resin and the warmth in the olive wood. The combination of these two materials is always fascinating. The resin gets clearer and more reflective with every step, while the olive wood reveals more and more of its rich grain and color. This is the part where you can actually see the bowl coming to life right in front of you. A lot of people ask me whether I find sanding boring. Honestly, for me, it's one of the most satisfying steps. It's a moment to slow down, to focus on the small details, and to see how every pass of the sandpaper transforms the surface. What about you? Do you enjoy this part of the process, or do you prefer to skip straight to the finish? Let me know in the comments below. I'm also curious, when you're working on epoxy or wood projects, how high do you usually sand before you start polishing? Do you stop at 600 or do you go all the way up like I do here to 3500? Every maker has their own approach, but I've found that taking the extra time here always pays off, especially when you see that final glossy surface shining under the light. With the sanding finished, it's time for the final polish. I'm once again using the same two polishing compounds that I used earlier on the outside of the bowl. The first one is the coarse compound, made with pumice powder, mineral oil and beeswax. It gently smooths out any remaining micro scratches and evens out the surface, especially on the epoxy. After that, I switch to the fine compound, which contains diatomaceous earth, beeswax and mineral oil. This one really brings out the depth and reflection in both the wood and the resin. The surface starts to glow with that natural silky shine. What I love most about these two polishes is that they're completely food safe. We've been testing them for a while now, and they not only create a smooth, glossy surface, but also leave a protective layer that feels pleasant to the touch. And now for the final step, the finish coat. For this, I'm using a product called Propolitura, which you can buy from the company Samson Kamnik here in Slovenia. It's made from natural propolis, and it gives the bowl a beautiful warm glow while also providing an extra layer of protection. I really like this finish because it enhances the wood's natural tones and gives the epoxy a clean, almost glass-like reflection. Plus, it smells great. There's something special about using a natural finish to complete a piece that's also made from natural materials. This is the moment where everything comes together. The olive wood, the epoxy, the shine, and you finally see the full character of the bowl revealed. To finish the project, I'm attaching our Pipejawood logo to the spot I prepared earlier at the bottom of the bowl. This small detail is always my favorite part. It's the final touch that completes the piece and marks it as one of our handmade creations. I am really happy with how this bowl turned out. The combination of olive wood and Artline crystal epoxy resin looks absolutely stunning, and the colors blend beautifully together. A big thank you to Artline for sending me the epoxy resin to test. It performed perfectly and gave an incredible clarity to the final result. And of course, huge thanks to all of you for watching this video and supporting our work. If you enjoyed this project, please give it a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future videos. I have some really interesting projects coming up, including what I'll do with that smaller bowl I cut out earlier, so stay tuned. Thanks again for watching, and see you in the next one. At this point, I already have my resin blank prepared. It's made from a mix of epoxy resin and pine cones, which gives a really unique and natural texture inside the material. The blue pearl color of the resin contrasts beautifully with the warm brown tones of the cones. Once it's polished, it will really stand out. I'll start by drilling with a 12mm bit for the cap section. That's the part that will hold the top of the pen. Then I'll switch to a 10.5mm bit for the body, which is the section you hold when writing. It's important to keep the holes perfectly straight so the brass tubes will fit tightly later on. These brass tubes will be glued inside the blank to provide strength, stability, and the perfect connection between the resin and the pen hardware. I always take my time with this step because precise drilling makes everything easier during assembly later. Now it's time to prepare the brass tubes before gluing them into the blanks. I start by sanding each tube lightly with 80 grit sandpaper. This roughens the surface just enough to help the glue bond much better later on. After sanding, I color the tubes with a black permanent marker. I began doing this because I noticed something interesting in previous projects. When the epoxy layer is very thin, the brass color can sometimes show through the resin once everything is polished. It doesn't look very nice, especially when the light hits it, but when the tubes are colored black or in a tone similar to the resin color, the final result looks much cleaner and the metal inside becomes almost invisible. Once all the tubes are colored, I can glue them into the blanks using thick CA glue. I applied the glue along the tube, slowly insert it into the drilled hole, and then use activator to make sure it sets quickly and firmly. After everything is glued and the adhesive has cured, I leave the blanks to rest for a few minutes. This gives the glue enough time to fully harden, and then they're ready for the next step, trimming the ends and preparing them for turning. Now that the glue has fully set, it's time to trim the ends of the blanks perfectly flush with the brass tubes. This step is really important because later when we mount the bushings on the mandrel, everything needs to fit precisely and sit at the correct angle. If the ends are not trimmed square to the tube, it can cause alignment problems when fitting the finished parts to the pen kit. To do this, I'm using a special tool, the Pipejawood-woodturning pen trimmer and reamer set. You can find a link to this tool in the description below. It's a very practical tool because it has carbide cutting blades and a set of interchangeable shafts that fit directly into the brass tubes. There are 10 different sizes available, so you can easily find the right one for any pen kit. The trimmer cleans up the resin edges and ensures that the brass tube and the blank are perfectly flat and aligned. This guarantees a clean, tight fit once the pen is assembled later on. I always take my time with this part, because precision here makes the rest of the process much smoother. Now I can mount the blanks on the mandrel. First, I choose the correct bushings for this fountain pen kit. They will define the final dimensions of each part. Then, I slide the blanks onto the mandrel, placing the bushings on both ends to keep everything perfectly aligned. Once everything is in place, I tighten the mandrel and mount it onto the lathe. Now everything is ready for turning. Now it's time to start turning. For this part, I'm using a carbide tool with a round cutter. This type of tool works great for shaping epoxy resin because it allows very smooth and controlled cuts without too much pressure on the material. The round carbide tip is especially useful when you're working with hybrid blanks, like this one part resin, part natural material, in this case pine cones. It helps reduce chipping on the edges and prevents the resin from cracking or tearing out. When turning epoxy resin, it's important to use light passes and keep the tool sharp, because the material can heat up quickly and start to melt or become sticky. I always take my time here and slowly shape the blank down to the bushing size, making sure the surface is even and the transition between the resin and the cones is smooth. You can already see how the blue pearl epoxy starts to shine as it takes shape. It's always exciting to see how these materials reveal their pattern once the surface gets smoother. Since we are already about halfway through the video, what do you think about this combination of epoxy and pine cones? Would you like to see me try a different color next time, maybe a deep red or emerald green? Let me know in the comments what color you'd like to see in the next pen. Stay tuned, because in the next steps I'll start sanding and polishing, and that's when the real magic happens. The resin will become crystal clear and all those details hidden inside will finally come to life. At this stage, I'm filling all the small holes and imperfections inside the pine cones. For that, I use a 2-part CA glue together with activator. This helps to fill every little gap and makes the surface much more stable before finishing. Once the glue is cured, I take the carbide cutter again and carefully remove any excess glue from the surface, leveling everything out. After that, I sand the entire piece up to 400 grit, making sure it's completely smooth and ready for the next step. The surface already feels perfect, and we're getting closer to the most important part of this project. Now that the surface is perfectly smooth, I can apply the final finish. In this case, I'm not going to sand any further. The blank already has a nice even texture after 400 grit. For the finish, I'm applying a thin coat of CA glue, which gives the pen a hard, durable and glossy surface. It also seals the epoxy and the pine cones, protecting them from moisture and giving that beautiful deep shine. In my case, the edges still need a little correction, so I'm using the Axminster wood turning pen trimmer and trimmer set again to clean them up. This tool allows me to make sure that both ends of the blanks are perfectly flat and square to the brass tubes. It's a small but very important step. If the edges aren't even, the parts won't fit together properly during assembly. The trimmer removes just a tiny amount of material, enough to ensure that everything lines up perfectly. Once both ends are cleaned up and smooth, the blanks are completely ready for assembly. And here it is, the finished fountain pen made from pine cones and blue epoxy resin. If you like this video, please leave it a thumbs up and subscribe for more wood turning videos like this. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.